Today, we're going to talk about a massive crisis unfolding in Europe's most famous industry. It's a story all about geopolitical chess and what happens when one move goes disastrously wrong.
Today, we're going to talk about a massive crisis unfolding in Europe's most famous industry. It's a story all about geopolitical chess and what happens when one move goes disastrously wrong. So let's just jump right in with the big question here. How is it possible that an action, one that was specifically taken to protect an industry, ends up being the very thing that crushes it? It's a huge paradox, and it's at the very heart of this entire story. Because, well, that's exactly what went down. Back in late 2025, a single decision by one government, the Netherlands, basically lit a fuse. A decision that was supposed to be a show of strength has instead kicked off a crisis that is seriously threatening the survival of Europe's entire auto sector. So let's break down how this whole thing went completely off the rails. And we have to start here, with the core of the issue. This wasn't some random external shock or a natural disaster. This was a crisis that Europe manufactured all by itself. At the center of it all is a company called Nexperia. They're a huge maker of semiconductors. You know, the tiny little chips that are the brains inside of everything, from your phone to your car. And here's the crucial detail. Its corporate headquarters are in the Netherlands, but it's owned by a big Chinese company called Wingtech. This split identity right there is the fault line where this entire crisis started. So what was the event that kicked it all off? We're not talking about a fine or a slap on the wrist. No, this was a full-on seizure of a private, foreign-owned company by a European government. You really have to look at the timeline to get what's going on. In December of 2024, Nexperia's Chinese parent company, Wingtech, gets put on a U.S. blacklist. Then, just a few months later, on September 30th, 2025, the Dutch government makes its big move and seizes Nexperia's Dutch operations. The timing here is, well, it's pretty telling, isn't it? Now, the legal tool they used to do this is fascinating. The Dutch government pulled out something called the Goods Availability Act. This wasn't some modern trade law. No, this was a law they literally dug up from the Cold War, something designed to protect them from the Soviet Union. By using this law, the Dutch were sending a message. This isn't a business dispute. This is a matter of national security. So officially, the Dutch government gave a few reasons: protecting their economic security, some vague claims about serious governance shortcomings, and the real kicker, preventing a future supply disruption. But come on, let's look at the reality. This all happened after tons of pressure from the United States in its chip war with China. The Dutch never offered any real proof of a threat, and to a lot of people, it just looked like the Netherlands was doing America's bidding. And this is the moment. This is where a big geopolitical power play turns into an absolute economic disaster. This quote just sums up the blunder perfectly. In their big move, the Dutch government completely missed a simple, catastrophic fact. They seized the address, the brand name, the corporate shell in Europe. They grabbed the mailbox, you could say. But China? China kept the house. And here's the breakdown. The Netherlands got the headquarters, the brand name, the legal paperwork. But the real value of Nexperia, its actual heart, was never in that Dutch office building. The real factories, the production lines, the foundries, and the thousands of skilled workers who actually make the chips, they were all deep inside China. And the scale of this miscalculation is just staggering. The factories that China still control pump out over 60 billion semiconductors every single year. These aren't fancy high-end chips. They're the basic workhorses that you need for absolutely everything, especially cars. A single car can have thousands of them. The Dutch thought they could control all that just by seizing an office. They were so wrong. So think about it. The Dutch just committed an act of economic warfare. But the very thing they wanted to secure was sitting completely at the mercy of the government they just provoked. Beijing's response was fast, predictable, and absolutely devastating. China didn't need to do much. They basically just flipped a kill switch. First, on October 4th, bam, they banned all exports of Nexperia's chips. The tap was turned off. Second, a simple memo on WeChat told every employee in China to completely ignore any instructions from the Dutch headquarters. And just like that, the company was torn in two. The Dutch were left holding an empty shell, a zombie company, while China essentially just nationalized all the parts that actually mattered. And this is where that high-level geopolitical game comes crashing down to reality on the factory floor, hitting an industry that was already struggling with competition and a weak economy. The first big domino to fall was Volkswagen, Europe's biggest car maker. They announced they had to hit pause on producing the iconic Golf. Now, Nexperia wasn't selling chips directly to VW, but their chips were buried deep in the supply chain. Without them, VW's suppliers couldn't build the parts they needed. And suddenly, the assembly lines just ground to a halt. And this wasn't just a Volkswagen problem, not by a long shot. The main industry group that represents all of them, the European Automotive Manufacturers Association, put out a statement that was brutally honest. Without these specific chips, parts cannot be built. This wasn't a small disruption. This was a threat of mass shutdowns across the entire continent. And that kicks off this horrible feedback loop, this death spiral. Production stops. That leads to the threat of mass layoffs. In fact, Volkswagen was already talking about emergency wage programs. That, of course, crushes consumer confidence, so people stop buying cars, which then forces even more production cuts. It's just a vicious downward spiral. But the real tragedy here is what's happening to the smaller guys, the often family-owned businesses that are the backbone of this whole industry. They don't have billions in the bank like Volkswagen. For them, having a critical part just disappear overnight isn't an inconvenience, it's an extinction-level event. They're facing a terrible choice, either default on their contracts or just shut down for good. Okay, so let's zoom out. The immediate economic pain is obviously terrible, but the long-term strategic damage to Europe's standing in the world, that might actually be even worse. This one move has shattered Europe's reputation as a stable, rules-based place to invest your money. It's created a new playbook for how to legally take a company's assets, not because they did something wrong, but just because of politics. And in doing so, it handed China a massive propaganda victory. China now gets to paint itself as the reliable partner, while Europe looks unpredictable. And this brings us back to the ultimate irony of this whole fiasco. Remember why the Dutch government said they did this? To prevent a supply disruption, to make sure they had chips in an emergency. Instead, their action is the one and only reason the chips aren't available. They literally created the exact crisis they claimed they were stopping. So as we wrap this up, the whole saga leaves us with a really critical question for our times. In a world with all these competing powers, what is the real price you pay when you decide to sacrifice your own economic well-being just to align with a geopolitical partner? The Nexperia case gives us a pretty devastating answer. In the end, this quote just says it all. The seizure didn't protect a supply chain, it sabotaged Europe's own industrial base and told the world that its laws can be bent for political reasons. This wasn't just a miscalculation, it was, as the quote says, like an entire continent deliberately sawing off the very branch it was sitting on.